Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our second public session of the day, Interlinked Challenges, Food Security, and Peace. My name is Hannah Quibo, and I'm the Senior Program Associate with the Wilson Center Africa Program. Our guests in the audience know this, but for those of you who are joining online, perhaps for your first time, the Africa Program works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, build mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. Today's event is part of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP. Established with the support of Carnegie Corporation of New York, the SVNP is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Wilson Center's Africa Program to bring African knowledge and perspectives to U.S., African, and international policy on peacebuilding. Before introducing the speakers for this panel, I'll take a few minutes to set the stage for our discussion. The food security challenges facing the world have become starkly evident in 2022, and parts of Africa are increasingly at risk of acute or chronic food insecurity. Although magnified by Russia's war in Ukraine, challenges to Africa's food systems have been both an issue of concern and of positive action for many years. The African Union declared 2022 the year of food security and nutrition. The United States dedicated its presidency of the UN Security Council in May 2022 to food security, including a global food security call to action. Very recently, Kenya's newly elected President Ruto has built food security as a key part of his economic platform. And food security is a top agenda item at COP27 occurring soon in Egypt. So those are just a few recent highlights of the attention on the issue. To today's discussion, food security and peace have mutually reinforcing linkages, both positive and negative. Are the current strategies to enhance food security accounting for those linkages? This panel will assess the food security landscape in the context of peace and peace building in Africa. It will evaluate the efficacy of engagement and intervention of stakeholders and look at positive examples of building resilient food systems in Africa. Finally, it will provide options and recommendations for how to adapt approaches to reinforce peace building and build inclusive, sustainable food systems. One final note, we are live tweeting and taking questions for this event on Twitter at Africa Up Close. You may also send questions using the chat box on the website. With that, I will introduce our speakers in brief. Dr. Nicholas Ozor is the Executive Director of the African Technology Policy Studies Network, ATPS, in Nairobi, Kenya. It is Africa's leading science, technology, and innovation policy think tank. Dr. Eugenia Kaitisi is the Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Analysis and Research, IPA Rwanda, and is the leading independent not-for-profit research and policy analysis think tank in Rwanda. Dr. Laure Tall, finally, but not least, is the Director of Research at IPAR in Senegal. IPAR provides research and analysis to support national and sub-regional policies to transform the agricultural sector to support economic and social transformation. So I'll turn it over to our speakers for their 8 minutes of remarks. Dr. Ozor will kick us off with his remarks addressing the current landscape of food security and food systems, how they're challenged, and the nexus between food and peace. So Dr. Ozor, for 8 minutes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Moderator Hannah, for having me. I'm delighted to speak on this topic because during the initial meeting we had, the first day we had our union at the Wilson Center, I mentioned that a hungry man is an angry man. And this is the best way to provide a linkage between food security and peace, because when we have enough food or sufficient food, we tend to have peace. When we are gainfully employed, we have less time for crisis to think about crisis. And my intervention, as Hannah introduced, we take just about three-pronged approach. The first approach is just to provide this landscape of food security. I will call it food and nutrition security for it to be complete, because food security alone cannot sustain. So food and nutrition security, and then provide the interlinkages on how they can sustain peace, or at the flip side, trigger conflict, and then provide maybe some recommendations going forward. So just for our knowledge, when we talk about food security, we are talking about when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that will support human well-being in terms of making them to also be active. And there are four basic components of food and nutrition security which calls to mind with respect to food and nutrition security. So we talk about food availability. So food has to be available in the first instance, and that leads to processes that lead to food availability include production of the food. The next component is access. So when food is available, people have to access it. It has to be accessible to people for them to be able to utilize it. Because food may be available, but if it is not accessible, then it creates an insecure situation. The next component, the third component, is use and utilization. So when food is available and accessible, we have to also utilize them in forms that will be able to sustain human well-being for us to be active in our daily activities. And in the form of utilization does not just end in consuming it, but also include processes that will lead to prolonging the shelf life of this food so that I can consume it today, consume it tomorrow, and consume it next year. That's why utilization or value addition to this food is very important. The next component, our final component for food and nutrition security, is what we call stability, food stability. So for food and nutrition security to be stable, and that sits very well with the concept, the linkage of peace, because stability means that the prevailing socioeconomic and environmental conditions, and most importantly, political conditions, are conducive for the other remaining components to happen. For instance, the production to happen, because when there is crisis, you cannot produce. When you are running for your dear life because of conflict, you cannot produce. So stability will mean both political and economic. It means also predicting that there could be danger. For instance, if you're able to predict that there is pest and disease invasion or locust invasion on your farm, you'll be able to begin to look at solutions to addressing the issue of food insecurity. So these are the aspects of trying to understand the food and nutrition security landscape. And again, let us not fail to understand that Africa, as of today, is about 1.3 billion people, and by 2050, it will be about 2.6 billion. This is very critical with respect to providing enough food that will feed these mouths. And if we look at the landscape in terms of landmass, Africa is about 11.7 million miles squared or 30 kilometers squared. million kilometers squared, and yet only 6% of this landscape is utilized for arable production. And this is too small to feed this number of people that are increasingly coming out as population of Africa. So we have to do business unusual if we are going to feed this number of people that are escalating on a daily basis. And what are the linkages that are exacerbating, either positively or negatively, the issue of food security linkage with peace? One, we talk about the production of food. We talk about the underdeveloped agricultural sector, because most of us still use crude implements in production, and that cannot sustain. We talk about climate change, and we have seen where drying of rivers have led communities to move from one location to another. We have seen where desertification is forcing herdsmen to move with their cattle to invade areas in search of pastures, and thereby invading the territories of arable crop farmers, and this triggers conflict. So these impacts of climate change are very critical. The over-reliance on primary products, where we just depend only on our primary product without adding value to it, is creating opportunities where we don't create jobs, and so on and so forth. Lack of implementation of policies. There are a lot of policies that exist that if African governments follow, we will not have issues. We have all the frameworks. The STISA 2024 has prioritized food production, food and nutrition security. The CADEP process is clear in terms of prioritizing agriculture. The Malabo Declaration of 2014 has provided frameworks for supporting food and nutrition security. But out of those, I'm not talking about national policies, because they are there always. But are we implementing these policies? We are not, because of one reason or the other of interest to ruling government. Take, for instance, the Malabo Declaration requires African governments to invest 10%. I'm just using one indicator. 10% of their gross domestic product, the value, in agriculture. But as we speak, it is only 4 countries that have come near beyond the basic threshold of 6.6 index. That's Rwanda. Thanks to Rwanda, they're doing great. That's Mali. But that was prior to the current crisis, because I was going to say political instability is also one of the conditions that destabilize peace and also reduce production. So, but Mali was there, Morocco is there, and Ghana is there, amongst all the 4 countries. But now, with some other crisis situation, countries are dropping below the threshold. So if I'm to talk about, I'm not talking, maybe I'll allow my colleagues to talk about COVID and the Russia-Ukraine crisis that are all triggers. But one key recommendation I will make here is in terms of business unusual, is that we must adopt science, technology, and innovation if we are to transform agriculture. Currently, we are promoting artificial intelligence, the use of machines to mimic human thoughts and reasoning and creativity in solving agricultural problems or challenges. So artificial intelligence has helped, or for instance, we are promoting that in Africa currently on the development, deployment, and scaling of artificial intelligence in the area of agriculture and food systems on the continent. And this, because it is a new and emerging area, we are trying to breed and support young and emerging innovators to use these technologies to promote and sustain food and nutrition security as well as peace, because when one is full, When your stomach is not hungry, you tend to think better. The last one is about policy. We believe in the slogan that policy is superior to science. Maybe researchers might oppose this, but I can tell you, having worked in the area of policy for the last 15 years, there are indicators that show that when you get the policies right and you implement them, actually it drives the process of even research priority setting. Thank you very much.
Madam from Rwanda, you've got an introduction already. So turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hannah. Yes, I've been introduced as Eugenia Kaitesi, and I'm the executive director of the IPA Rwanda. We are leading a think tank, but the other think tanks, we are just independent leading think tank. Yeah, I won't divert so much from my brother's introduction. An introduction has been said. I look at agriculture, the food, nutrition, and the peace. But I also want to highlight Ozor. Dr. Ozor mentioned that Rwanda is actually implementing, it's one of the leading countries that is implementing CADEP and the Malaba Declaration. And I will speak into the reasons why Rwanda is actually coming up as one of the leading countries in the implementation of the CADEP. So according to FAO's data, nearly 256 million people in Africa suffer from severe food insecurity. We have hunger is on the rise, with 20% of the population suffering from undernourishment. This feeds into a big population in Africa, then still remains vulnerable to challenges of economic marginalization, hunger, and malnutrition. And like was Dr. mentioned, this is despite positive achievements and positive development strategies that are on the continent. One wonders why we still have such a huge people of Africans and suffering from the malnutrition, with hunger, with whatever. There's also limited progress on the agribusiness and the agro-industrial development, which is a major source of otherwise unemployment opportunities to the youth, to the women, and we have to really look into this one too. So, although there is a disputed link between conflict and hunger, some strategies to promote peace overlook this link, leading to unsuccessful efforts that deal with symptoms of conflict other than the root causes. Given that livelihoods of millions of men and women in Africa are dependent on agriculture, the emergence of conflict has life-changing and serious implications. For people who rely on agriculture, conflicts, it's been mentioned, destroy their food systems, decimate crops and livestock resources, and cause loss of assets and incomes, which of course trigger conflict and which trigger food insecurity in many of our countries. On the flip side, however, people living in countries affected by conflict are more likely to be food insecure and malnourished. Dr. Ozor mentioned about Russia and the Ukrainian war. This has a compounding plight of millions of people who are thrown in. It adds on the compound plight of millions of people who are thrown into poverty by COVID-19 pandemic. And this, of course, requires an urgent action by a number of our governments and the development partners. On assessing the extent to which current strategies enhance food security account for the link between peace and security, there's a broader literature on how to improve food security in developing countries, and proposed measures include, among others, suggested amendments in global trade rules that restrict the ability of food exporters to impose export bans, stricter rules on food commodity speculation, the institutionalization of grains reserves to stabilize prices in times of crisis, the creation and expansion of national social security mechanism, and lastly, boosting investments to raise agricultural products and adapt sustainability to changing climates. However, only few papers discuss food security in the context of violent conflict, and those that do mostly analyze the issue from a more global perspective. We do not actually go deep into our own countries to really look on the ground and see the causes of this food insecurity. So food insecurity can therefore be both a consequence and a cause of conflict. Given the centrality of food insecurity to such a violence, food security perhaps ought to be allocated an even higher priority in many conflict-prone countries. We talked about, I said that I should be talking about lessons from Rwanda in achieving food security goals under the Malabo Declaration. I'll look at least 3 areas of 4. One, Rwanda really invested a lot in capacity to innovate. When moving from policy promises to results, capacity to innovate is an important factor regarding benefiting from innovations. So Rwanda has done better than most of African countries in the implementation of technological innovations for food security, and from one smallholder to another. So innovations in Rwanda's food security include, for example, I'll use Rwanda's word, but I'll translate. I know very few understand Kinyarwanda in the room. So the smart Ngungane, this Ngungane is like I support you. It's a technological platform that has captured farm level data in order to de-risk farmers and help in the distribution of inputs such as fertilizers to farmers and any other inputs in agriculture. We have what we call Isoko Platform. Isoko is market, and it's e-market where farmers can access up-to-date market information on the prices of their goods and really do anything that really relates to the Isoko. We have the Irembo platform, and this is an e-government platform which enables the access and provision of government services, and this is where most of government services are really being offered, and they are all online. So this has curbed a lot of corruption, it has curbed the delays, it has curbed a number of things. Everything you want to access now in Rwanda, you do it online, and this has not left out farmers, even the less educated. When we talk of good governance, innovation processes for food security are hindered by barriers related to governance. The knowledge, socioeconomic factors, and resource factors. Rwanda has good political will to implement Malabo declarations aimed at enhancing food security with a good accountability mechanism. I had a cite by the Minister of Agriculture who says that national strategies are aligned to the Malabo to GADIP framework. So anything in agriculture is actually completely aligned to that, and that's why the implementation is quick and it's well realized. The fourth or third is effective implementation mechanism. This one is coming to overcome the barriers. There's a need to go beyond defining goals and proceed to the next step of establishing effective implementation mechanism or institutional arrangements. This is what we have in Rwanda, which is called performance contracts, where district mayors and the governors annually sign with the president their annual targets. And these are comprehensive, action plans, including agriculture and any other plan that's in Rwanda. And these performance contracts are annually evaluated for accountability. And therefore, you have to implement unless otherwise. But of course, this does not leave out, mean that we have all the resources. It has their own challenges, but these challenges are continually monitored, continually addressed, and this helps in the implementation of, such good strategies for the country. I talked about planning, how I looked at the first strategic plan for agriculture, transformation in Rwanda, PST4. And this one aims at moving the agriculture sector from subsistence to a market-led sector, contributing to exports and job creation. And this is strategically aligned to the national continental and international agriculture development agendas, including CADIP. I hope my minutes are still there. Policy recommendations. There are a number of steps policymakers can take to design and implement most of these policies. One, we need to recognize that conflict often occur with and are related to other shocks such as economic crisis, price shocks, and natural disasters. An example is the Ukrainian war, Russia-Ukrainian war, which has really added to the COVID impact of losing jobs, of everything that came out with the impact. So we need to constantly be aware that such shocks may come and plan well for them. We need to refrain from increasing subsidies, a favorite policy measure in times of crisis, which may help keep poverty and food insecurity levels low, but do not build resilience. Implementation of Malabo Declaration requires that member states mobilize adequate technical and financial investments. And he mentioned 10% of our national budgets.
GDP.
And I don't know whether African countries are actually living up to the standard of raising at least. I don't know which percentage countries are bringing up, but we should be able to invest in the 10% at least. Then we need to implement CADEP, as we mentioned that. And lastly, we need to include climate change adaptation as an integral part of conflict prevention, in part because climate change is expected to significantly increase the likelihood of conflict in the future. Invest in increasing price information systems, introduce and expand credit and insurance markets, geographical targeting of social safety nets, and construct functioning and effective institutions as key measures of building resilience to conflict. Agriculture needs to be put at the center of our national developments and international development. This is where 70 or 80% of our people rely on agriculture. And when you look at the budget, when you look at the targets that we have as countries for the national developments, sometimes agriculture is really left behind. So countries need to increase their investment to allow smallholder farmers to access technology to boost productivity. And lastly, countries need adequate access to finance for agriculture sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Tall, I invite you to give your remarks.
Thank you. I think that the table is set. You've given a very good context of the state of food security in the world, but in Africa in particular. I will just accentuate and focus on some numbers. The projection forecast for food security are showing that in 2030, the majority of hungry people will be in Africa. This is not the case now, it's Asia, but in 2030 it will be Africa. And Africa will be the only continent with an increasing number of hungry people. All the other regions in the world will see a decrease following this projection. Today, when we are gathered here, more than 11% of my people, Senegalese people, will not eat today. It will be 20% in Ethiopia, 39% in Democratic Republic of Congo, and 62% in South Sudan. So food security is not a minor challenge for African countries. We talk about food security when the world have been producing the most. Food production had been rising steadily over the recent years, over decades. In 2019, we reached a record high of production of food with 9.4 billion tons of primary crop produced. So that's huge. And in the same time, you have an increase of hunger. what we have to realize is that food production is dominated by rich countries with heavy subsidies for their agricultural sector to produce food. Then these countries produce a lot, have surpluses that they export to poor countries, which can undermine greatly the domestic food industry. In comparison, in low-income countries like Senegal, for example, there is little support to farmers, and these farmers cannot compete to this food coming for richer country, cheap food that is coming in. So today we are facing a food crisis with an increase of the global market prices for food. So food crisis is mainly a crisis of poverty because we have food. Food is available, but people cannot afford to buy this food. On the current global market, we see a rise of the major food commodities, with is particularly impacting vulnerable communities, countries that rely on imported goods. Between April and July this year, we show very high inflation in almost all the low-income and middle-income countries. Over 90% of these countries have seen inflation experiencing inflation. And the thing that is important to say is that it's not only that the food price is high, it's that this price is increasing very rapidly. From 1 month to another, you can have a 5%, 10% increase for staple food. This situation is a consequence of the Ukraine-Russia war, yes, but it is symptomatic of the way we do business, and we do food business. Following the war, or what we are living now, we've been seeing that there is an increase in trade restriction. You've been talking about that. But the trade restriction is not only between producing countries and people, country receiving this or importing it, it's also among African countries. Recently, ECOWAS has emitted sanctions to Mali after the coup in Mali. And these sanctions are on trade and a movement of people. Are these sanctions really efficient? This is the question. But there is a toll on food security. Food security and conflict, this may be an evidence to the people in this room, but it is not that evident. We know that there's a link between food security and climate change, yeah, bad weather, bad production. Mm-hmm. But what is the link between food security and conflict? There are direct links. Dr. Ozor have been talking about displacement. If you are not on your land, you cannot produce. There is also destruction of agricultural assets when we are in conflict and war. But there's also the indirect effect, and that's what we are seeing from the Russia and Ukraine war. Disruption of markets, increasing food price, and other things. And this can be at the global level, but also at the very local level. So when we talk about food insecurity and how we can tackle it, it is at the base of attaining our SDGs, but also at attaining peace and stability in our countries. We've been talking today about food security, but do we only want food security, Dr. Ozor? You were talking about food security as a way of having food for all people at all time and sufficient, safe, nutritious food. But I think that aspirations around food are greater than food security only. We also want food sovereignty. How we produce this food, who is producing it, what are we eating? Do we eat what we produce? Are we producing all that we eat? We also striving for rights to food, the same way we are striving for rights to peace. And I think it's 2018, there's a UN resolution on human rights to food that was voted, and the United States did not sign it yet, I would say. So food security and conflict in Africa is not the problem of Africa and Africans only. We know that colonialism is one of the main piece of the food globalization or the globalization of food system. That's how it worked. We also know that there is a lot of initiatives and attempts to make this food system more sustainable, to make this food system open to a larger number of people. And last year, the UN Food System Summit was one of these initiatives, an example to create dialogue on this very important question. However, looking at this summit, the way it was organized, the people that were on the table, we know that global food system is not the right table for we Africans, because we do not have the voice in this global food system. Dominant food, global agricultural system, they are the ones that are causing a threat to the planet on an environmental level, but also to humans, because we do not get the nutritious, the good food, the food produced sustainably. The industrial food system is one of the largest contributors to climate change, and we know that. So this global food system and industry, how can we wait for them to be the solutions when we know that they are the problems? So if we want to ensure food security and tackle the crisis of hunger, this food industry, food system need to be diversified, and we need to avoid the oligopoly of a few companies coming from rich countries. For many decades, we have been telling to African countries, and we have been saying to ourselves that the solution to food security is producing more. But it is not working. I will talk about Senegal, that I know a little bit more than the other African country. Agriculture is seen as what they call it, the motor of the economy. We have been spending a lot of money on the agricultural sector. And most of this money was coming from development aid. 60 to 80% of the public spending on agriculture is coming from development aid. And still, we do not see direct impact of this investment on food security. So we need to change. We need to go out of this business as usual. We need to change our approach. And while food production is part of the solution, we need to recognize that it is not the entire remedy. So, because I am from an institution that is deeply rooted in the family farming movement and is coming from farmers' organizations' womb, I would advocate to support, to strengthen resilient, local or regional food system, to support food system policy in African countries. Because what we have now is policies that are in silos. We will support agricultural production, we will support industry, but there is no link between all these things, and we need to have policy for our food system. So my main message would be how we can reflect on food system for our African country and how we can support them. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for your remarks. Dr. Ozor, you led us off with a sort of a broader view of food security, the elements that comprise it, and linkages to peace, and then highlighted the importance of policy implementation, that the policies exist, but implementing them. And I appreciate Dr. Tall's your remark on it's not always also just formulation or implementation, but it's linking and harmonizing some of these policies. Ms. Kaitisi, I appreciate also your lessons and examples and practical solutions that Rwanda offers. And one of the key points I picked from your remarks was accountability and building in accountability mechanisms. So I just want to appreciate all three of you, and Dr. Tall also to really underscore your bringing us down from this global, maybe global level, continental level, but even a regional, local level, and the importance of looking at food systems in that context. So with that, I'll turn it over to our audience for the question and answer period. So please raise your hand, identify yourself and your question. I'll also take questions online, which my colleagues will text me. And all right, we'll start over here, Katachu, and then come over to this side.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting presentation that I heard from the panelists. I'm Getachew from the African Institute of Governance and Development of Ethiopian Civil Service University. I have general questions to all of you, and the first one is to the marginalized community like pastoralists in relation to food security. And you see those people do not have border in terms of getting food for their cattle and for themselves. So how do you see from the African perspective of food security of those pastoralist communities? The second one is, as we all know that more than 70% of our population in Africa are youth, and still they are in problem. And let me borrow the concept that hungry people. When the hungry people are not able to get food or employment, obviously they will eat their leaders, and that's I think what I heard from one of the authors in Africa, and that is basically conflict, leading conflict. So what kind of policy really very important in terms of entertaining those people, of getting food, or to avoid from marginalization from food insecurity, from food security for those communities? Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. I think there were hands on this side first. I'll take this side and then come back. Two more, and then give you a chance to answer these three, and then start back over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. My name is Shotola Olusegun from Nigeria. Dr. Tall, you food sovereignty, importation of food, food inflation. I'm just wondering whether you think we have sufficient local capacity for food production in a way that we can actually stop importation and have a full, somebody tweeted recently that she's waiting for her bread from the UK, and this person is in Nigeria. So, and this throws up a lot of comments under the tweet to say, so you only eat bread from the UK? I say, yes. The bread from Nigeria is this, that. Now, these are individual preferences, but I can see the policy discussions or the conversation, the debate around it to either influence governments to say, yeah, we are banning all importation of food or of this specific number of food. So I just want to hear your view around whether you think we are in that direction. Now, to Dr. Nicholas, my last question about value addition and genetically modified food. And I know people have their individual opinion around it, and I know recently they even said there are rice that you don't even need to grow from the ground again, so that it just. Now, given your knowledge and experience, which direction do you think this is going? Will it be appropriate for Africa to say, if the value, whether the best value we are adding will be through that route of doing genetically modified food, or we should still just retain and allow our system to grow, naturally? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning once again, colleagues, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Vuyo. Dr. Toll, I heard you talking about that it's not about production. I'm shocked a bit. In a continent where 60% plus people are involved in agriculture directly, and we still don't have food, and we say it's not production. I can't reconcile that. Please explain it further to me. Because for me, it's production. Fix your production and all other things shall come unto you. Because we don't have the food in the first place. And it goes to what Dr. Ozor said. Is it really prudent for us to talk about value addition of a final product, which is an upstream industry, which is a downstream issue of the value chain, when the upstream is very inefficient? When we're talking about food security, I think the alpha of it is production, again, because we need to evaluate what we have harvested. We need to beneficiate what we have harvested. So the questions link, what are we fixing? The last one, it goes contrary to what we're talking about. Food sovereignty. Sovereignty as Africans, as nations, question. When we talk about economic integration, globalization, are we angry about globalization, or are we not going to use the word? Are we dissatisfied with globalization because we have not integrated into the global systems in a way that benefits us because of faults that are ours or because of the system that is global? I would beg to say, largely it's because of the fault that is ours, where 60% of us farming still cannot feed ourselves. It's a dilemma. I'm not very clear with my question, but I would be very happy if you explain that.
All right, our very efficient audience has asked, the three of you have asked 7 questions, so I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to select the questions you'd like to answer. I think I'll start with you, Dr. Ozor, and then work our way down. Question on marginalization and youth inclusion. 2 questions looking at food sovereignty and local capacity, as well as value addition, and several questions on value addition and food sovereignty. So, Dr. Ozor, lead with you, and then Dr. Kaitisi and Dr. Toll to address those.
Okay. I will also take from last to go to up. You talked about the upstream versus downstream value chain additions. And that is where the issue of policy come into place. And it is very, very important that if policies are right, if we make the right policies. That is the first step, but it doesn't lead us to the promised land. We must implement the policies. And that is why African heads of state met in 2014 and said, let's invest 10% of our budget in agriculture. And everybody agreed and signed. Now, how many countries are doing that? So does it mean we've not made policy? We made policy. And countries that have adopted and implemented that policy, there is a direct correlation between those that adopted that policy and impact. And that's why you see Rwanda. That's why you see Ghana. That's why you see Mali before the crisis. That's why you see Morocco. Because they have invested this 10% of their budget in agriculture. And they are reaping the benefits of that investment because it trickles down to both production, both employment, both security, and all the rest. You talked about, yes, production is all that it takes. No, production is not all that it takes because I provided about 4 components. Production, you may have the food, but you can't access it. But let me also tell you something about production. In Africa today, 30 to 60%. Actually, when food security is discussed, for those who are in the utilization sector, they say if we can utilize effectively what we have produced, we will not have food insecurity. Why is that? 30 to 60% of what is produced rot away in what we call post-harvest losses. So now, you see, you've produced. But now you are not able to utilize efficiently. You are not able to provide the silos. You are not able to provide the storage mechanisms. You are not able to do other things, process them, add value to prolong the shelf life. Tomato produced by Dangote, you can buy it, fresh tomato, at maybe 1 piece. You can buy it at, let me say in Kenya, 10 bob. 10 shillings, $1. But when these tomatoes, when you add value to tomatoes and produce the paste, the pastry, you buy that same tomato at a factor of $10 per one. So, and not only will you buy it at 10, you can see the comparative advantage. You've added value. And if you don't add value, the tomato will spoil within 5 days to 10 days. Now you've added value, you can use it for up to 1 to 2 years. You see, the production is not only the problem, you have to do other chains to ensure food security happens. The other aspect is about the person that talked about GMO. And that links to what I'm trying to say. The concept of genetically modified organisms, countries have to make situational analysis about how it impacts on them. I will suggest and recommend that as they make this situational analysis, first of all, start saving the food you have produced so that you don't have post-harvest losses before you engage in GMO, because there are a lot of issues relating to GMOs, which countries, like if you don't have food at all, like what happened in Kenya at a time, people we are dying in Turkana region because there was no food, and this is true. Somebody dies because he has not eaten for 5 days. And yet, there are places where if you go to McDonald's here, you find that about 1% of the food that are brought in the stores are spoiled, are thrown away. While some don't have at all to eat. So somebody was contesting do we say we don't like GMOs because people perceive that there's a linkage between consumption of genetically modified organisms with cancer? Because that is the truth. In Kenya in 2013, Kibaki government banned GMO because the health minister had a relation that died of cancer. And he said, and that's where I was coming to the fact when I said policy is superior to science. The health minister said, because of this is now personal, I ban GMO development, production, scaling in this country. So if you are the best researcher who can transform the country using GMO, your career is finished within the geographical territory of Kenya. And that is how it happens. So I will not totally condemn GMO, but I will say countries should make situational analysis on how food production and utilization affects them, and be able to know whether after engaging in other interventions, including saving the food that have been produced, including hybridization, there are other methods to increase food production and utilization. After doing all those, and yet you don't have sufficient food to feed your people, then move to the next level. But don't just say, oh, GMO is the way, and you start developing GMO, which you know leads to what we call, because somebody was talking about food sovereignty, that's what we call technology lock-in. Technology lock-in is when you depend on Monsanto for your seeds, for instance. And Monsanto seeds, every year you must buy the seed to plant, to get yield. And over the years, your native seed system will face extinction. When it faces extinction, you are totally dependent on these Monsanto seeds. It yields well, it looks creamy, fine, good. Now, if your country, perchance, commits a sin against United States of America, a sin in quotes, maybe you offend one or two of their foreign policies, and they tell Monsanto, stop the supply of the seeds to this country. Do you know the implication? Because you have technologically locked in your country into this GMO product, this is biological weapon.
Okay.
This can be used to keep your people dying for many years, because you cannot have access to your genetic materials that originally your fathers and forefathers used to sustain food security.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll stop here.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think two are directed. One was directed to her, another one was directed to us. So I'll respond to the one of marginalized communities, pastoralists. And I thank my brother from Ethiopia for bringing up this. It's always been on my heart why people really suffering. He talked of people, Turkana people in Kenya. We have Karamajongo in Uganda. I'm sure in the southern Africa, there are people really who are suffering in the deserts. And I want to give an example. For example, immediately after the war in Rwanda, we had some parts of Rwanda actually where people were dying of hunger. They had no food. But today no one is actually dying of hunger. So it all comes back to the the policies, the strategies that we put in place for these areas and for these people. And again, Nicholas was talking of production. If you talk of food, it's not only, I know our great people used to depend on milk. How do we increase production for these people that are really moving up and down? How do we educate them? Because most of these people are really not educated, and they think, you get your herds, people, you move with 100 cows that are not producing. So the policies that are in place to really increase the production for these people, to do the processing of them, milk production, to even, plant trees. I always really feel bad for the desert areas. And when you come back to politicians, and I hear that some of these areas are actually areas for politicians for their use. They want to. Sorry, I was talking of like Karamajong areas, and most of those areas have got gold, and politicians do not want to develop those areas for their own interest. So how do we educate our people? How do we really bring them on board? How do we, make use of the land? How do we increase the production? That one becomes an issue, and it should be part of the strategies development partners and the countries should be putting in place. I also felt that I should comment a bit on production. We are talking of increasing production, but post-harvest storage of our food. But how do we also do the agri-production? How do we bring industries out of this food that we have? How do we do the processing? We were looking at production just for our mouth and we feed, but for future, post-harvest infrastructures need to be put in place. When these people have got limited knowledge on the agricultural production and the best practices, how do we educate our people? This storage production is of high cost. How do we manage the cost issues? So these are all issues that policymakers, development partners should look into and try to really educate populations on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Several questions for you, Dr. Tall.
I have the feeling that my two colleagues have answered most of the question, so I will just add a bit on what has already been said. For the marginalized community, especially the pastoralist community, there's more and more effort to include them in all the plan, especially the early warning plan. One of the issues that we see in the Sahel area is how do we reach out to this community, because they are nomad community, they are in movement community, and how do we reach out to them to give them social protection, food supply? How do we get in contact with them? And new technology are becoming more and more important in this in this emergency plan for pastoralists. So if we keep on talking about marginalized community, they will be more and more integrated in the global planning. I am very happy that we are talking about food sovereignty. It was for me, this panel was for me a platform to launch this idea and to make people talk about it, because it's quite rejoicing for me to be in Washington and talk about food sovereignty in Africa. So the scale of this sovereignty has to be discussed. It can be local. I can say I want in my little city to be able for all the schools to give locally produced food to the kids. This can be an example of food sovereignty. It can be at the scale of my country, of the scale of ECOWAS, scale of 2-3 countries. This is something that we need to discuss and put on the table. When we see ban in trade for food with the Ukraine and Russia conflict, then we have to discuss this question of food sovereignty. When we see that countries in Asia are stopping export of broken rice. Broken rice. Don't laugh. Senegalese people, we prefer broken rice to long rice. And you all know that broken rice is a waste of rice production. But even the broken rice in certain Asian countries, they have stopped the exportation of this type of rice. So if we don't discuss this question, then we are putting our head in the sand. Do we have sufficient local capacity for production? We have the potential for sufficient local production, we know. Do we produce actually enough? For certain type of food, yes. But we have the question of waste, no? Post-harvest loss, which is when we talk about onion value chain, they say that 60% of the onion production in Senegal is lost post-harvest. And if we look at only the production, we would be self-sufficient in onion, more than self-sufficient in onion. But in certain period of time in Senegal, and this is the case now, you have the price of the kilogram of onion that can be multiplied by 10. And how can you make yassa without onion? So it's a real problem. So this is one, and the other thing is that when we look at the investment in agriculture, there's more and more investment in the agro-industrial complex, and we are producing, but who are we producing for? Mm-hmm. When we talk about Senegal, we think about peanuts, but peanuts is for imports. It is not for the local consumption. Most of it is imported. Mm-hmm. So if I put all my efforts on producing peanuts to import it, and then the price of peanut is going down, and the price of wheat is going up, then who is losing? For me, food production and food security, food sovereignty, food rights, it's a question of diversification. I am not advocating a one model fits all countries, but we need to be open in the option that we have and be able to support the different scales and the different types of agriculture.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions, starting with Dr. Mugume and then some folks on this side. I saw hands.
Okay, thank you very much, members, for very interesting discussion. Just my contribution relates to, for example, I'm Peter Mugume from the University of Rwanda, Centers for Conflict Management. Thank you so much. So my contribution is, yes, you've talked about food production. That is right. That is one step. I'm trying to categorize them into three. One is the primary process, primary level. At the primary level, I'm talking about this production. It's very interesting that you find that in some parts of African countries, even within countries, the region is producing more than it actually needs. That is one. The second, which I call secondary, is the supply chain, which I think we also need to talk about. You have produced this, but what about the other part that has no food? How does this person who produced more than enough transports the produce to those who need it? I'm talking about the secondary because you may find that there are some challenges, some to do with the infrastructure, road networks from rural areas to those areas that are needed. This takes us to another level. We're talking about food security from this level, but production is not enough without food. The supply chain in terms of enabling environment. The third level, which is the final, it relates to what I call tertiary level. By tertiary level, you are talking about adding value to what you have produced. This is the processing of the products. Some of that will require money, some of which in our countries, in some parts of our countries, is not enough. So I think, to be brief, there's the primary level in terms of production. We need also to think about the supply chain, which is a serious challenge internally and externally, if you want, plus the adding value and processing in order to get more in terms of inputs, leave alone education, because some people have food, unfortunately, which food they don't consume, which contradicts the definition of food security. which Dr. Nicholas mentioned. That is a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. I promised this side, Helen, so I'm going to go over here and then I will catch your question. Yes, Mr. Weintraub.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service. I wonder if the panelists might address the issue of land tenure, land ownership, land title. There are many different types of land ownership, whether individual or group, and there's a lot of ideas about the idea of credit for improving the land, for purchasing machinery, and often you don't get the credit unless there's a clear title to land. Now, that can also lead to problems. Can you sell your land? Can you be alienated from the land? Can you have absentee land ownership? And all that implies. So I'm wondering if some of you might address the issues of land tenure, land ownership, land title, whether this can hold some answers.
Hold their hand up. Yeah, Adam?
I just wanted to add to that question, and it's the issue of loss of land for mining purposes, and this is happening in Ghana. I mean, I think there'll be a time where we won't have land to farm with anymore because there's a lot of interest in mining in Ghana. A lot of Chinese people are coming in, grabbing the land for mining, gold especially. And there's another problem which is very understated, which is kleptocracy, where we have a lot of money from foreign entities coming into, because they don't want to put money in the Swiss banks this time, they come and buy land for real estate. And again, we're losing a lot of arable land because of that. I don't know if any of the panelists can address this, but it's just a point I want to make at this point.
Thank you. And then Helen had a question.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Helen Keziawa, and I work with the Women's International Peace Center. Thank you very much, panelists. Dr. Laura, there was something you talked about, 62 or 65% of South Sudanese who could go without food. And I was just wondering, I mean, the research, the population, I mean, on what basis? It's quite high and alarming, but I mean, just to be clear in terms of, how the data was generated. Then the other one is, what then can be done, in terms of preservation of food? Because what is also happening in Uganda is that in the West, there's a lot of food that is being produced, is not being consumed, is wasted. But in Karamoja region, people are dying of food. And we keep asking ourselves, what would it take to transport this food from this place to the other? And how do we preserve food, it internally? You talked about onions, what can we do to preserve food which are seasonal, that we could consume throughout the year? And then the last for me is, for three of you, within all the conversations you have had in terms of reflecting on food security and peace building, are there gender dimensions to that? In terms of food production, what is also like the percentage of women who are engaged in this production at a large scale, and are there policies that specifically focus on supporting local women food producers? Because we know they do a lot of agricultural work, in Africa, but I don't know to what extent, that level of work is contributing to the economy. I don't know how far it is contributing to food security. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I will turn it back over to the panel to address these questions. The first, looking at a question about land tenure, title, and ownership. A question that I would add is of particularly an issue where I'll speak in the U.S. sense, U.S. policymakers could have a lot more understanding from being from a non-African context. And then looking at loss of land, particularly for real estate, or other purposes that Dr. Adem mentioned. And then addressing Dr. Helen's question about gender, women smallholder farmers, policies targeted toward them, and what those look like. And then a couple questions that folks have been asking about food sovereignty, local supply chains, local production, and feel free to address those how you want. But I think what would be interesting in addressing those is we talked about these big level policies, CADP, Malabo, et cetera. When it comes down to local implementation, what would you see are the biggest gaps, particularly for even the example of in the same country, transportation, et cetera? So that's my challenge to you with the questions. I'm going to reverse order. So Dr. Tall, you first, and I'll end with Nicholas.
Thank you, Anna. It's a shame we did not talk about land governance more. We did not talk about land governance because this is what a building block of food production. If there is no security on land tenure, then there is no production, because obviously it is difficult to invest in a land that you don't own. What we see is that for an increasing number of countries, the legal framework on land tenure exists. But how this framework is disseminated and how it is used, there can be some gaps. For example, in Senegal, we see a lot of discrepancy, a gap between land tenure by men and women, for example. But following the law, there should not be any differences. But this is something that is a social and cultural heritage. And it is now a question of educating farmers on their rights and educating women on their rights. Recently at IPAR, we've made a study on land governance, land tenure, and women and land tenure. And one of the leading researchers on this work was saying, when we talk about land, there is no such thing as men or women. It's just you have the money or you don't. If you have the money, you can buy land. If you don't have the money, you can invest on your land. Because the land for farming there is no property title in Senegal for this type of land. You just have a right of usage. So if you go to the bank with this paper, it may be difficult to get money to invest. So the inequality is continued with this type of land governance scheme. So yeah, and there's a problem, and it is still a question that needs some reflection. When we look at the question of land mining, it's different. For example, in Senegal, there is a big divide between among civil society organizations around this question of land for big industry. Some organizations want to call it land grabbing, and other organizations are saying no, it's not land grabbing. It's a large scale land acquisition, because it's legal. And who is giving this large piece of land? Local government or national government. So it's completely legal. So it's not a question of grabbing. And this question of land for mining versus land for industry versus land for agriculture, it's a question of country and community perspective approach. What do they want for their future? Are they only thinking about the present? I give a big piece of land and then get money a little money now, or do I think about the future? So this is something that we look a lot. We research a lot at IPAR, the perspective of the territorial perspective. And this is something, an exercise that can be very interesting. So I will stop here. I talk too much, sorry.
Amy? Okay. Okay. Let me start with Dr. Mugume's. I think it was an addition, and probably an area of emphasis which I want to talk about is for African countries, we really need to think of storage, invest a lot in storage and food processing. We are having a lot of food during the production period, and during the different other seasons, food is not there when it was really wasted. So post-harvesting, storage, agro-processing. One time I was taking a visitor, I think from one of the, well, I don't remember whether it was Korea or we moved around Rwanda, and he told me that I wish what I'm seeing around these the roads could be the industry, small industries, that are producing for agriculture, processing or whatever. So we really need to invest a lot in that. On the land issue, I know Rwanda has got really a land issue. We are a small country that is highly populated, and so land, there's no how do I say, there's no chance of really wasting land. Every part of land is really properly utilized and is properly allocated. So it all comes back to the planning. We have, yesterday when we talked about conflict, and I said it was a resource issue, the conflicts that really happened in Rwanda was revolving around, the limited resources, the limited land. People are fighting for the limited land, what our ancestors want. Some other people came up, pulled them out, others came in. So government had to really intervene and plan the land well. So we have the land well demarcated for settlements. We have land that is demarcated for industries. We have land that is demarcated for farming. And if the land is not really well utilized, then it's taken away from you. So you have to utilize the land. For agriculture, the country has invested a lot in cooperatives, and for big cooperatives that are really coming up to increase production. So the settlement, well, we are looking at settling, moving up, like New York maybe next time, one of these days, because the land is limited. So I think countries need to intervene and plan well their land and avoid wastage of the land. Even those that have big land. I was telling, is anyone from Zimbabwe? When I moved to Zimbabwe, and I looked at the land that is really a wastage of a lot of land, and it's unutilized, and people are dying of hunger. You ask, where are the policymakers? How can policymakers really intervene and make use of this land and make sure that they produce not only for themselves, but for Africa at large? And lack of resource. People talk of resources. How do we make sure that the little resources that we have are being properly utilized, or we get even the resources from the properties that we have? So with land, it's a question of planning. I'm not a land expert. Maybe Mugume will tell me, but I know most of it is owned by government, and then people get titles. You get a title for settlement, you get a title for industry if you want to really come up with the industries, and then investors also are given titles. On the Helen issue, it's a big issue. No, the Helen question. Sorry, I hope I got it here, but it's still a problem with women. Women are people that are really involved in this. When you look at agriculture, I think I don't know. I don't have proper statistics, but majority of women are the ones that are tilling land, and the own production. I don't know whether production actually all production goes to women. So it is not, again, a question of how are these people really being planned for, and how for Rwanda it's 50%. If the land is for you, the family, then you have the 50% ownership and the husband has 50% ownership. You gain from the production. What you invest in, you own it. If your husband is not there, no one will come to talk about land. It's you, the next in kin. So it all comes again to, policies, procedures, and the implementation of these. And the leadership is very key. How do we make sure that we use the leadership that we have? Dr. Ozor,
Thank you.
That's your time.
We have 3 minutes left, and I'm very conscious of the fact that Dr. Ozor has warned us that you all might be angry if you're hungry, and this lunch is ready. So I don't want us to go over. Dr. Ozor, I want to give you a chance to answer. So I would say select 1 or 2 questions and answer in the next minute and a half.
A hungry man is a hostile man.
Concision. So
Okay.
I'll turn it to you, and then I'll close this out.
Is that a threat?
Yes.
It's not.
It is.
Okay, let me try and address part of what the interlinkage is here between what Helen said and what I heard from the other side. Yes, there is serious gender dimensions in food and nutrition security, like she said, rising from their engagement. Women are critical in production, in access, in utilization, even in stability. However, there are gender roles in food and nutrition security because men, no matter, even though women contribute in terms of production 75%, the decision of crops to plant or the decision-making process is also handled by men. But women may do the actual production. But decision-making, just like in any other, with respect to agriculture, lie heavily on the men. This links with the gender, the land tenure issue, which you raised. Yes, in most countries, it depends on countries. Most countries confer rights on the government. Like Nigeria, the Land Use Act of 1978, government owns every land. Then you get titles. But through the inheritance traditional system, it's only men that own land.
Wow, that's bad.
Is men that own land in Nigeria in terms of inheritance. Okay. Women, unless you decide to buy with your money, you are not entitled to land. Oh. And even if you are a woman, and is only assuming that in terms of that inheritance, the man, after owning the land, can decide, to sell, but a woman cannot have access and rights to land.
Thank you.
And that is the traditional system. For mining, I would say what is most important, like in Ghana, is the policies of what we call mine closure. Because when they usurp these resources, most of the foreigners leave the land like that, and it exposes the land to a lot of danger. So we've been helping Ghana to develop mine closures policies so that we still hold the exploiters responsible for processes that lead to mine closure. Maybe I'll end here.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for the discussion today. For our guests online, thank you for joining. I would like to highlight 2 recent SVMP papers that will be published this month looking at the topic of food security. One is Food Security Systems as Drivers for Sustainable Peace Building in Africa, the Case of Kenya, by Dr. Florence Odiwar, and Herder-Farmer Conflicts in Southeast Nigeria, Plugging the Gaps in Peace Building Policy Framework, both touching on the topic of food security. will be available wilsoncenter.org. End of the month. Thank you all. We're concluded.